to protect the bay. My name is Scott Busey. I'm a board member here with the chapter. First of all, thank you for coming. I really appreciate the turnout and the support. We're going to get started right away with Ruth. Ruth's a senior scientist with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the Pennsylvania office. She's responsible for providing scientific support on policy initiatives and working with local government businesses and concerned citizens on watershed protection and restoration. She's a registered professional engineer with 10 years of experience in low-impact development and advanced stormwater management design. She's also worked with the Pennsylvania DEP in the stormwater management and abandoned mine reclamation sections. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering Technology from the Pennsylvania College of Technology and a Master's of Science in Environmental Engineering from the Pennsylvania State University. Thank you, Ruth, for coming. And I do have a sign-in sheet that I'm going to pass around. And all yours. Thanks.
Fantastic. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Show of hands, how many engineers, surveyors, architects do we have in the room today?
Landscape architect.
Landscape architects, I apologize. Landscape architects, yes. I am an engineer, forgive my ignorance. Sometimes I just forget that word. Some of this may be a little bit repetitive for you, and it may be a little bit basic, and I apologize for that. But I did want to just say that we are going to focus a lot today on urban stormwater, specifically with regards to the regulations, how they work, how they're structured in Pennsylvania, and how we can really identify some opportunities to bring in green infrastructure as we work through those regulations. Late last year, early this spring, we worked, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation worked with URS to provide a series of municipal public education and outreach workshops for municipalities holding MS4 permits here in the lower Susquehanna region. And one of the things that we learned is that there's a huge disparity in the amount of understanding between what a watershed is versus what their watershed requirements are for permitting, what their permit requirements are, and some of them didn't even know where to go to start to ask questions. So this is sort of a summary of the lessons learned that we took out of that exercise, as well as an overview of what I took away from it as an engineer. So some of these, no, show your hands, I like interaction, sorry. How many just sat through Harry Gable's presentation on the 24th? All right. Some of this will be repetitive for you also, and I apologize for that, but I'll try to make it as painless as possible. So today, what I'm gonna try to do for you is put together the puzzle that is urban stormwater management. And I say puzzle because there are a lot of key players and there's a lot of things that come together. There's a lot of partners that have to work together to make that happen. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the Chesapeake Bay. Stormwater and water quality. I'm gonna get down into the weeds for a lot of the stormwater regulations, and I know I can lose some people when I do that. I'm very passionate about that, so forgive me if I spend a little bit too much time on that. And then I'm going to talk about urban stormwater management specifically, some of the challenges and barriers to implementing that, as well as some opportunities for solutions. So to start with, we're going to talk about the Chesapeake Bay. And I think you guys pretty much know where you are within the bay, you know what the bay is, where it is. It encompasses 64,000 square miles. 2/3 of Pennsylvania drains into the bay, and it's a really important part of the East Coast Mid-Atlantic ecosystem. But it really starts here at home. It's our local streams and rivers that feed into the bay. So anything that we can do to improve the bay, improve the local water quality in our streams and rivers is going to help us improve the water quality in the bay. This is a graphic I'm sure you've seen before. On the left is what we don't want to have happen, and by restoration and improving water quality, we want to end up with what's on the left, or the right, sorry. This is another graphic that I'm sure you've probably seen before. It's a list of the pollutants that are coming from Pennsylvania to the Chesapeake Bay by source sector, and I know it's a little difficult to read. The large blue areas under nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment are most definitely ag. That is one of the biggest contributing sources. What's important to note on here, though, is that those red and green segments right there, that's your urban stormwater and your suburban stormwater. Those are the sectors that are actually increasing. All of those other sectors are showing improvement by reducing pollutants. Urban and suburban runoff is not, it's actually increasing. It's the only major source of pollution that's still on the rise, and if things don't get turned around quickly, we may not achieve the 2025 goals for the Bay and beyond. So moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about stormwater and water quality. You guys are old hat, you guys know what this is all about. You guys are landscape architects, surveyors, and engineers. You deal with this all the time. But this is just another way to drive it home. The top 3 sources and causes of river and stream impairment here in PA are ag runoff, AMD, and urban suburban runoff. It's the number 3 cause. And when you think of urban areas, I know that I typically think of places like Philadelphia and Harrisburg, where you literally walk out of your front step onto a patch of sidewalk, you cross the street, which is all impervious, you step up the curb right into another building, and you never touch a blade of grass. There's nothing green, it's all urban. And that's true, that's a really good definition of urban, but there's also impacts from those suburban areas when you get things like land conversion. And I know Harry had some great statistics in his presentation in the last session, but in Pennsylvania, we convert land grades in a manner that is inconsistent, or out of whack rather, with the national average. Most states, when they have new people move in, the average land conversion is approximately 0.6 acres. In PA, that's somewhere around 4 acres. So we're doing a lot more manipulation to the surface of the land when people move here as opposed to other places. So not only does that mean increased impervious due to housing, roadways, but it's also other infrastructure. Anything that requires an amenity, putting in a septic extension and septic tanks that aren't on a wastewater treatment plant collection system. All of those things have an impact on how the watershed works. It also means there's a lot of lawn. And this is one that Harry, I think, had in his presentation just a second ago. Lawn is really awesome. It's beautiful, but it's really, I don't like mowing my lawn. I really don't. So I have taken steps to reduce the frequency with which I mow my lawn. I don't use fertilizers. I don't use any pesticide. I don't use anything like that. But what's interesting is in some of those new residential developments, when you have those houses first go in, and you have your contractors laying down sod, underneath that sod is soil that's compacted almost to the extent of it being concrete. So the whole thing acts like kind of a fuzzy sidewalk, if you will. It rains, it doesn't go very far, and then it runs off very, very quickly. So these are all things that we want to take into account when we start thinking about urban and suburban runoff and how that impacts the watershed. Especially when we think about that, this is a dated slide. It's 2010, and I really need to update it. But given the fact that development has sort of leveled off, I still use it anyway. But you can see where a lot of the development is expected to, the development pressure is taking place. And it's right around here, right where we are, Lancaster, York, Dauphin. And it does make sense that it goes through there. There's a lot of major heavy highways that go through there. It's a good transportation hub. There's some really awesome schools in the area. So there's a lot of land conversion that happens there. This is another slide that I'm sure you've seen several times in many different places. But it just goes to show that when it rains on a natural area, your runoff is much, much, much less than it would be from an urbanized area, and that leads to greater aquifer recharge and more evapotranspiration. Now, in all of these changes, when you take a system from this and turn it into something like that, it makes big changes in how your streams and rivers react. I really like this one. I'm not sure where it came from. I haven't credited these graphics. But it really does go to the local flooding concerns. When you have a naturalized system and it rains, the next day the water levels rise slightly and then they come back down, but you don't have any major flooding and you don't have a lot of dry creek beds. In a fully developed area, it's exactly the opposite. When it rains, it's very flashy, it peaks very fast, and then the next day the water levels recede and you're in it with hurt the fish. But that's where some of the flashiness comes from. So it sort of sets the stage for what happens when we take our areas that normally look like this and turn them into streams and end-of-pipe results that look like that. And the result of that is, the loss of all those things that we like to do with our streams. It causes increased flooding, it can cause drinking water, pollution concerns. There's also the disease, not just for fish, but human contact as well. So moving on, this one's my favorite. I'm sorry, this is where I maybe a little repetitive for you guys, and it may get a little dry. But we're going to talk about stormwater regulation, and this is where the puzzle piece really comes into play. I used to think the stormwater regulation in Pennsylvania was like an onion, because there were just so many layers that you had to peel away, but I like the puzzle better, because if you make it, you can solve a puzzle. can't really solve an onion. You can either take it apart, it'll make you cry, but you can solve a puzzle and then you got something good to look at. So we're going to start off with the federal regs. Everyone knows about the Clean Water Act. In 1972, it established the NPDES program. That was Section 402 and 303 also established the TMDL program. On a federal level, the NPDES and TMDL programs are typically what drive most of the urban stormwater management requirements. However, federal facilities are exempt from those requirements. In 2007, the Energy Independence and Security Act provided guidance for federal facilities. Federal facilities are now required to manage the 95th percentile storm on all federally owned and operated facilities, like the Army Depot in New Cumberland, the only one that I can think of. Any federal prison facilities and things like that. The other big federal regulation that impacts municipalities here in PA is obviously the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. And that was in 2010. And Harry went over that in much more detail. But if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them as best I can. But we're going to get in a little bit further into the NPDES program. It requires stormwater management controls to be implemented for construction projects, industrial applications, and municipal facilities. And that's where the MS4 program comes in. And this is where our work with URS earlier, or late last year and early this year was really eye-opening. Only because there was, like I said, a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding, and lack of education on the municipal permit holders' part about what they had to do for that MS4 permit. So, you guys may or may not know this already. The MS4 is a federal regulation. It's administered by the state, and it's implemented by your local municipalities. So this is the onion in the puzzle. This is the one piece that all three come together, and they really have to work together. The permits that are issued to municipalities are issued by PADEP. The municipalities that are eligible and obligated most times to have an MS4 permit are located within census-designated urbanized areas. And they meet specific criteria that are outlined in the Clean Water Act, as well as in the permit documents themselves. Of note, in this region here, MS4s are required to develop, implement, and report on Chesapeake Bay pollutant reduction plans. And they're required to do this on an annual basis. And that's to demonstrate progress towards the Chesapeake Bay TMDL goals that have been established in the 2010 Chesapeake Bay TMDL. To make it even more complicated, if there are local TMDLs, whether they are for nitrogen, phosphorus, or sediment, or other pollutants of concern, those must also be addressed by a separate TMDL plan, which must also be reported on under an MS4 permit. And I do have a note at the bottom, municipalities aren't the only ones to have MS4 permits. PennDOT, correctional facilities, Turnpike, they also have MS4 permits, and some other entities too, do also, like Penn State University also has one. But we really wanted to focus on the municipal aspects because that's where most of your urban and suburban runoff is going to happen. So the NPDES MS4 program requires 6 minimum control measures: public education, public involvement, construction site runoff, post-construction stormwater management, illicit discharge detection and elimination, good housekeeping, pollution prevention, and like I said, where it's applicable, there's Chesapeake Bay pollutant reduction plans and the TMDL plans. So that was a federal regulation administered by the state and implemented by the local municipalities. So now we're going to talk about state regulations. I know there are others that impact a lot of your projects that require the address of stormwater management. These, in my opinion, are the big three. We've got the Clean Streams Law, which is the driver for the other two. The Pennsylvania Stormwater Management Act, Act 167, which was mentioned in several other presentations here today, and Chapter 102, specifically the post-construction stormwater management requirements. I put this up here, and I'm not going to read this to you because I hate it when people read the slides, and I know I've been doing that way too much this afternoon, and again, I apologize for that. I didn't have enough coffee this morning, but I had too much this afternoon. But I do like to point out that the PA Clean Streams Law was passed in 1937. It's almost 40 years before the Clean Water Act, Federal Clean Water. And if you look at some of the language in here, I think it's pretty awesome to be from the state of PA, because this is language that was abate pollution in 1937, provide protection of water supply and water quality. I think those are really important tenets that we've seen come through a lot of the regulations in Pennsylvania since. And I think this is a good basis for a lot of the information that we're basing our regulations and laws on. Again, with the PA Stormwater Management Act, some of you probably worked with the 167 plan and you were out there later doing the projects. The language is pretty consistent. You want to restore flood carrying capacity, preserve natural stormwater runoff regimes, protect and conserve groundwater. And the same thing you see again in Chapter 2 with the scope and purpose. That maintain, reclaim, and restore water quality. So these really are puzzle pieces within puzzle pieces at the state level that really help you, or that really stress the importance of water quality and protecting water quality and managing stormwater. And then we get into the local regulation. We talk about local codes and ordinances. Stormwater management has a lot of different facets. This is another puzzle in a puzzle. Stormwater management through codes and ordinances can be addressed with an Act 167 model ordinance. I think there's quite a few municipalities and counties here in South Central PA that have those. There are other MS4s that have adopted the MS4 model ordinance, and there are still a few others who have gone above and beyond what's the minimum required in their ordinance model. But that's not where it stops. That's typically where you go to find your volume control, peak rate control requirements, any additional water quality requirements, but things like your subdivision and land development ordinance is also impact stormwater management. That's where you're going to find your minimum street widths. How far back does your driveway have to be? All of that, is going to dictate how much impervious surface you have to put down on a particular project. And sometimes you can work with municipalities to be a little more flexible, a little more creative, get a little more green in there, reduce some of the curb heights, get rid of some of the pipe and inlet and do some more grass swales. Sometimes you can't, and that's unfortunately the system that we work in. Zoning is another one. Variances are fairly common. I know I've been through that process. You've got a parcel that you have zoned as ag and you want to get it zoned as commercial, and sure enough, 2 months worth of meetings later, it's changed and you've got a strip mall going up in what was a nice little farm field. So finally, we're going to start talking about stormwater management. We're going to talk about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities. And I really like this picture, only because I think it's an awesome depiction of a really complex, beautiful looking engineered structure in the middle of a reclaimed wetland area. This is in Wildwood Park in Hexford. And it just happened to strike me as one of those interesting mixes of nature and engineering. Anyway, so this is where the challenges of stormwater management, this is where the puzzle kind of starts to come apart, just a little. But you can see it's almost back together, so there's a way to make it work. Again, the work that we did with URS and some of the conversations that we had with the municipalities, the biggest challenge to stormwater management that we heard every single time was funding. We've got to pave roads. We have to plow snow, especially this winter. We don't have money to do any sort of green infrastructure. And we've encouraged them again through the workshops, and I'll mention this again, to be creative in how they think about funding things, be creative in grant writing, and look for opportunities that I'll get into later where they don't necessarily have to build a BMP for the sake of building a BMP. They can tie it into their planned projects. There's also the challenge of maintenance, specifically who maintains facilities on private properties. And that's a big question. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a solicitor, and there are a lot of questions out there about how that happens. Whether it's a deed restriction or an easement, again, it's about the funding, who pays for it, who's responsible, and that again ties in with the property ownership aspect. If it is private property, who owns it? Are they still occupying the space? Are they absentee? Has the city come in and condemned and reclaimed that property? If not, do they do that? At what point do they do that? And do they have to do it because they don't have any space available for future BMPs? So it's a very large picture. It's a very complicated one, a very complex one. and one that individual municipalities are going to have to address to an extent on their own, but they can also learn from the lessons of their neighbors. Solutions for stormwater management, I mentioned this a little bit before. Planned capital improvements and BMP retrofits. This is the case where you don't have to build a BMP for the sake of building a BMP. If you're going to put in a road, make some allowances and put in some green gutters or other options. Green infrastructure planning. Here in Lancaster, I know they've done a wonderful job with their green infrastructure planning. If they make it part of the process up front, it becomes second nature and becomes part of the routine. Operational and behavioral changes. Here's where you want to involve your public works and meetings. Very simple stuff. Getting them to talk through things. Having them recognize hazards before, or problems before they become hazards. Resource and income sharing. This is one that I'm really going to emphasize a lot on. Because this is another takeaway from the work that we did with URS earlier this year. There are 268, I believe, regulated MS4s in the South Central regional area of DEP. At any given time, one may or may not know what the other one adjacent to them, upstream or downstream, is doing. And there's a lot of good work being done out there. And it's just a matter of talking to your neighbors, whether it's your residential neighbor next door, or talking to municipal officials and having them talking to the municipal neighbor next door. There's a lot of good work going on out there. There's a lot of information being shared. There's a lot of lessons to be learned. And that's, I think, the biggest one in there. There's also increased public awareness, public education, and public outreach. So these are just a few examples of some of the solutions that I had talked about earlier. This is an image of a street in Philadelphia where they were doing some repaving and widening, and instead of just replacing the curb and gutter, more curb and gutter, they actually put in some trenches. So there's curb cuts to allow the stormwater to go in there and infiltrate. I don't have exact numbers on the cost, but again, it was a case of where they were coming in and doing some street improvements anyway, so they didn't have to build a BMP for the sake of just building one. From a municipal perspective, schools are another opportunity. I don't know what the cycle is, but I know that in the last 3 districts that I've lived in, there have been some sort of capital improvement project on those school campuses. It seems like every year. The image on the left is of a school, it's again in Philadelphia. That is a permeable playground surface, and that is in the inner city. They do actually have some stormwater management volumes that are coming out of that. And another option on the right is for parking. If you've got an area that only gets parking, say once or twice a year, I grew up rather in the upper areas of the Susquehanna, where there were a lot of Christmas displays. A lot of places only got parked on 2, 3, 4 weeks out of the year. It was always in November. Pervious parking options like pavers would have been an absolute godsend there instead of big empty parking lots that were just vacant for 10 or 11 months out of the year. Other planned projects. You heard CJ this morning talking about the Chicago City Hall that has the green roof on top with all sorts of amenities on it. If that's an option, explore it. Why not? What have you got to lose? If you can always apply for a grant, or if you have a developer that's coming in and they're interested in doing something more innovative, encouraging municipalities to work with them to get something like that on the ground. BMP retrofits. This is one of the easiest, lowest hanging fruit, and I really hate that term. This is one of the easiest ways to improve the functionality of dry basins and make them more aesthetically pleasing. Simple plantings, occasionally some soil amendments, some underdrains to slow release if you can't get infiltration through the native soils, and then some native plants. It's a great way to slow the water down, allow for some root uptake and root removal before it discharges. And they're everywhere. There's tons of them around. Again, green infrastructure planning. I mentioned this earlier. If you make it part of the plan up front and eventually integrate it into the overall process within your cities, it becomes second nature. Lancaster has a fantastic plan that has gotten a lot of press. And their plan really is to, and it's simple, it's the stuff that we do all the time. It's to infiltrate, evaporate, transpire, capture and reuse with overall reduced energy consumption. The operational and behavioral change, this is another one where I said maintenance matters. You want to make sure that you record and correct identified problem areas before they become a public hazard. If you've got inlets that you have to maintain and you see there are a problem here and identify them as such, don't let them get to that point before you do anything. Street sweeping and inlet cleaning. Here's a clogged inlet in Harrisburg, and then the result of those clogged inlets is a seriously flooded street. So, making those operational, or educating your public works staff, educating your maintenance staff, and making sure that they know what they need to do. And it doesn't stop here. I mean, if they're storing materials, make sure that they're not storing them on a porous parking bed, or if they've got excess cement, they're not just dumping it into an inlet or into a stream. It goes for contractors too. And again, the solution of resource and information sharing, knowing your neighbors, collaborating with your neighbors, and cooperating with your neighbors. York County, the Planning Commission has stepped up and has undertaken a huge collaborative effort with their MS4 municipalities, as well as several non-MS4 permitted municipalities, to bring them together to address their Chesapeake Bay pollutant reduction plans on a holistic measure. They really are looking at what they can do on a watershed perspective that's going to give them the biggest bang for their buck. And as a result of some of that, several of the municipalities are now talking to each other, including a few that have gone through EPA's audit process. And there are small little circles of information sharing happening there. For example, York City was one of the ones that was audited by EPA, and they took, I can't even speak to what their experience was, but they took that experience and prepared several recordation forms and other plans and processes internally to avoid being audited again in the future, to make sure that all the information, paperwork they had was there, was readily available. And they are now presenting that information as a lessons learned, along with the forms for all of their neighbors in York County, and I think they've opened it up to others also, just to get to know what they're doing, learn from what they've done. And they're also, as part of the watershed implementation plan, working together with the other 46 municipalities in York County to cost-effectively identify and implement a nutrient reduction BMP that's currently it's being considered. I don't have any details about which one it is or where it might go, but that should be out very shortly. Increased public awareness. I know there was a question in the last session about SARs now leaving the Chesapeake Bay watershed. But they don't have to necessarily be that big, they can be very small. If you live in a residential development and your basin is retrofitted, work with whomever funded the retrofit or your municipality and put some signs up. Encouraging municipalities to put things in newsletters and attend community events. And there's also, as homeowners, options that they can work with municipalities on to achieve public outreach, things like cisterns and rain barrels. There's certainly the more visual representation of stormwater management. There's also the rain garden option, which is usually fairly small and easy to install. I think I heard a gentleman say that he installed one on his property in about 4 hours. And again, those brick pavers are also an option for homeowners to address stormwater management on their sites. So putting the pieces together, local water quality impacts the Chesapeake Bay, and stormwater impacts can be mitigated by regulation, but there's certainly opportunities to address them without having to be forced to do so under regulation, whether it's voluntary homeowner option, or even some of the other options that we looked at here today. So if I haven't bored you to tears yet, and you want to know even more about MS4s, there is a webinar tomorrow, March 19th at 12 o'clock. We will CBF is hosting that with URS. It's entitled Putting the Pieces Together. It's geared towards municipal officials. It will go over the basics of MS4 permitting requirements. March 26th is estimating pollutant loads and managing BMPs. That's a much more technical webinar. We're going to talk about the WTM model, SWIM, and map shed. There will be a PDH for those engineers in the audience that need them. Workshops, March 25th at 8:30. Dr. Bob Pitt from the University of Alabama will be presenting a one-day workshop on using Windslam for MS4 compliance. If you're interested in attending that, there's also PDHs available for that. You can contact me, my email is there, or you can see me after. April 9th at 9 o'clock. That's down and dirty details. It's MS4 reporting. That's the Work City presentation of lessons learned from their EPA audit. They'll also give you a copy of the forms that they've done. For that, you'll want to contact Lindsay Garner, and her email address is there. If you can't copy it down in time, I'll be happy to forward it. And then CBF has a polluted runoff report that came out, I believe, about a month ago. And that's linked there. If you can't write it down in time, I'll be happy to forward that to you. And there's my contact information. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Ruth. We have plenty of time for questions. So if there are any, please feel free to ask them now. I'm going to pass out a quick survey. Did anybody not get the sign-in sheet? Does anybody know where the sign-in sheet is?
Oh, I have a sign-in sheet.
So Ruth, would you consider yourself sort of a resource for just about anybody
Absolutely.
looking to for a runoff and do a better job with the design and implementation of certain control features?
Yes. Yes. And if I don't know the answer, I'll be happy to direct you to someone who does.
Fantastic. I do a lot of work in the advocacy on behalf of the local chapter, and we're trying ourselves to position our organization as sort of a resource for local elected officials to ask questions when they have them about some of the things that we do. And I know Chesapeake Bay Foundation shares the exact same philosophy in trying to do that specific to stormwater management. So if you would like to become more involved with either one of the organizations, we would love to have you and welcome you with the explicit intent of being that resource to the elected official to try and make some positive change in our community. So, yeah, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us.
Question, your pie chart you had with the agricultural being the big red area. What is being done in that aspect? It seems like nothing is being done on the agricultural end of the year, as opposed to when we're doing work for urban or suburban design or commercial or industrial developments. It seems like we're getting the big grunt of all the stuff that we have to do. We don't see any agricultural issues to take care of.
That's a great question. And ag.
It's politics, right?
It's not, no, it's not politics. No, well, never mind, I'll do it. If you don't mind, Perry, I'll defer to you on that one. I'm not exceptionally well versed in the agricultural areas, but I do know that there are things like ag BMPs, covered crops, no-till farming, and a lot of other conservation practices that are being employed on the agricultural operations that have resulted in a significant decrease in the overall pollutant loads coming from the agricultural areas. Did you have anything to add?
Not really, actually. In my presentation, I did show a rate of reduction, and the lion's share of reductions coming from Pennsylvania are from the agricultural sector over the last 30 years, to the tune of 18 million pounds or more of nitrogen load reduced by the agricultural source sector. In contrast, urban and suburban stormwater runoff is actually increasing in size. So the reality, based on all the information that we have, is that the agricultural sector is doing their part of the problem, and dealing with their part of the issue, and are on track at a pace, whereas the challenges associated with stormwater runoff from the urban and suburban developments remain and in fact are increasing in some instances. And that's where the emphasis has really started to become on point sources, which have permitting requirements associated with them, and then of course with the stormwater components, some of the voluntary and regulatory sort of planning and implementation initiatives. For agriculture, it is true that the Clean Water Act and subsequently all of Pennsylvania's laws and regulations treat that entity explicitly and holistically different than, say, point source discharges from a wastewater treatment plant or urban stormwater runoff. And so there's a whole suite of other mechanisms associated with USDA, NRCS, Farm Bill, voluntary-based implementation that is at a very local scale, because they're dealing with a totally different sort of entity. Family farmers, they need technical assistance, financial assistance to get that implementation on the ground. But the reality is that the Clean Water Act treats them holistically different, and therefore the approach, particularly from a permitting scale, looks holistically different, except in the construct of whether or not you're a CAFO, a concentrated animal feeding operation, or a CAO, a combined animal feed operation, where you have animal-based agriculture. But Pennsylvania's laws and regulations are some of the most advanced in terms of agricultural activities in the Mid-Atlantic and the United States overall. Where the rub is getting farmers to compliance. We see a significant percentage of, based on informal surveys, of a large number of farmers that are not compliant with laws that have been on the books for 30 years. And in some cases, it may not even be their fault. But that's where that helping hand, that assistance can come into play to get them to compliance. It is the challenge.
Why isn't the conservation district going around and finding farmers like they are for the developer who put tire scrubbers at the entrance to a site that's minimally putting dirt on the road? But yeah, I can drive to my parents' house and see a 3-1 embankment on the side of a road with soil above it, with minimal vegetation cover, and when it rains, all of us run off.
Only one agricultural conservation district, only one conservation district in the Bay watershed, and largely in Pennsylvania, actually actively engages in some fashion of agricultural compliance in science. And it's based on a number of things, including their agreement with the Department of Environmental Protection that sets out the rules and regulations as to what they're allowed to do. And the vast majority of them have explicit in that agreement the ENS, and in some cases, a smaller percentage, much smaller percentage, post-construction stormwater management requires. That the ENS controls are by and large on an aggregate, something that is at the county conservation district level. It is a mindset, it is a culture, and it is written in their agreements that they are not the enforcement entity as it pertains to agriculture. They view that as a helping hand to get to compliance at the local level. And so they rely upon the Department of Environmental Protection, or as applicable, in some cases, if there's a federal component to this EPA, that is then therefore the enforcement body. So it's largely predicated on that agreement that they have with the Department of Environmental Protection and their culture as a helping hand for the farmers that has established that playing field.
Thank you.
I have a question. So you mentioned sod when it goes down. Is there any way to install sod and still have that the dirt under there being absorbed? And
Yeah, the problem itself is not with the sod, and I didn't mean to imply that it was. The problem is that general construction practices tend to leave any sort of subsoil very, very, very compacted. So reclaiming that, and there are guides out there available ad nauseum on how to decompact compacted soils before you place any sort of vegetative cover on it. And anytime you can do that, it gives an opportunity for it to act more naturally, to infiltrate and filtrate streamline networks and a runoff problem.
So in your opinion, I would welcome anybody else's opinion too. If a contractor were to truck in topsoil and place, say, 6 inches on the lot, but then use a skid loader to sort of smooth it out and then put the soil on top of that, is that sort of working?
No, you gotta rip the subsoil. You gotta rip that stuff.
The subsoil was stripped and he's trucking in new stuff. He's
Yeah, but you gotta rip it so that there's a binding potential there and building water.
So the subsoil needs to be decompacted.
Yes, you don't need.
I mean, to some degree, it has to be compacted because on a site when you have fill, you need to make sure that it's structural, but yet I think you're okay to rip the top foot so that at least the topsoil will.
If there's no structure, it's gonna go there.
Right. But that's the missing.
You don't put grass there either, structure's gonna
Great. The reason I ask, we do a lot of verification on homes. So on behalf of USGBC, I'm out at the home inspecting to see that they are meeting the LEED requirement. And we get fed a lot of information, from the builder on a lot of different things. I'm an expert in energy efficiency and how the house operates, not so much in the sustainable sites credits that I'm expecting. So that was the reason for the question.
You see a lot of, especially along stream banks and stuff, a lot of times you'll see these surfaces that people have bladed basically smooth.
Yeah.
And then they try to put topsoil on it or seed it or any of those things and it usually fails. You gotta get this roughing everything right back up again before it'll work.
Yeah.
Otherwise you just got a impervious layer. Or minimally.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's one point was in a conference, a professor recommended a scarification or plugging of your subsoil and then mixing a amount of a compost on top of that. And then that compost will actually break down the clay material and your compaction will actually loosen up for a better pervious subsoil.
Right.
So that'll cut down on your clay content. That's another thing, you're testing. You should always have it tested. See where you're,
To see where its errors are. Yeah. Yeah, we've got requirements to see that if the soil needs amended, that they've amended it. But a lot of times, what they want to do is till it to 6 inches, till the topsoil to 6 inches and plant. But in this very specific builder, it's a high-end luxury Bethesda builder, it has to be sod. And before I fight him on his losing his 2 points, I want to make sure that a little consensus anyway. So thank you. Okay. Well, thank you for coming. If you'll note in your program, we are having a reception. Mayor Gray from Lancaster will be joining us, and we're actually going to head over to Gordonier Hall. The happy hour networking event is included in your Greencon purchase. It starts around 5 o'clock. So please join us over there. And if you do want to stay for the Forever Green Awards, we'd love to have you. So thank you for coming.